And we are preparing for the 2020 Distinguished Environmental Humanities Lecture with Elizabeth Hoover, which will be on November 5th. My hope is that everyone has already RSVP'd for the lecture. The flyer should be coming up. Here's the flyer. Elizabeth will be lecturing us. She can talk more about this, but her title is called The Garden Warriors, From Garden Warriors to Gastro Diplomacy, Farmers, Chefs, and Water Protectors Working Towards Food Sovereignty. The event is co-sponsored by the IHR, the Global Futures Laboratory, the Human Sciences Collaboratory, American Indian Studies, the Global Institute of Sustainability, the Sweetie Center for Sustainable Food Systems, and the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. And Elizabeth is an associate professor in the Environmental Science and Policy Management Department at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm not going to go over all of her publications, but there they are. Please look at the invitation, take a look. Our next reading group will be on the 22nd. And on the 22nd, we'll be focusing on the impacts of COVID-19 on food systems. And that's something that Elizabeth focuses on in her writing as well. So, so we're really lucky that she has joined us today. And let's see, where did she go? I was looking at her corn background and now I don't see it. There it is, there she is. She's waving at us, and we're very lucky to have her today with us. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Joan, who's going to get us started.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming. This is a great showing. So we asked you all to read, some different pieces, and most, critically, Elizabeth's piece, You Can't Say You're Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself, Defining and Enacting Food Sovereignty in American Indian Community Gardening, and also the Kyle White article, Indigenous Food Sovereignty Renewal and U.S. Settler Colonization. So let me start, kind of start with that. But one of the things that were the kind of way of framing this whole topic was just kind of like, what is food sovereignty? And that, interestingly, Elizabeth's doing is kind of asking people that are engaged in activities that involve, food and food in indigenous communities, kind of what they thought. And I thought it was very, really interesting to see how all those different aspects start to unpack and start to help us think about food sovereignty. But to me, it's like I've been sort of thinking food sovereignty gets used in a lot of contexts. So I was just, like looking up, with, maybe Stuffed and Starved with Raj Patel, and just, how he talks about food sovereignty and how, so it gets used in a lot of different contexts, right? I mean, it isn't, and yet what I was interested in, that maybe today we might think about how is it unique in indigenous communities, and and what are those uniquenesses, and that I think both Elizabeth and Kyle actually draw out some of that. But I think that that's an interesting question, sort of like what is food sovereignty, and then in sort of specifically, how do we think about it in indigenous communities, and maybe specifically indigenous communities in North America. And I don't know, that's another question I'm interested in too, is thinking about communities, other colonized states around, countries around the world. I mean, are they the same issues? Are they different issues? And in particular, Kyle spends a lot of time talking about the sort of, settler colonization, and how that is a kind of unique issue, framework, problem that maybe is different in other places, right? So anyway, part of this is some people were great and sent us questions, so we've got some interesting questions, but maybe just to start off there, and Elizabeth was gracious enough to come and join us, but we don't want to put her on the spot either, because this isn't her official, time. But if there's a way in which we can, even ask for you know, her elaboration or have questions for her, you know, maybe she'll be willing to answer them, or she can shut off her audio and not do it. It's a great thing about Zoom. You can just zoom out pretty easily. But anyway, so I'd like to start with, you know, what is food sovereignty? I mean, does anybody want to start out with that question, or sort of how do you think about it, and how is it different or similar in the context of indigenous communities versus how it gets used, say, in, you know, with the these other international groups that are using that notion? Sarah, maybe I'll put you on the spot because you're from Egypt and you have that perspective from Egypt. Is this a notion that in North Africa is getting deployed, and is it similar or different from what say Elizabeth or, you know, or White in his article? I mean,
so it's interesting because Egypt is one of the few countries in the world that currently in its constitution has the word food sovereignty in it.
Oh.
Which was a really fascinating process post-revolution 2011 of how that term got inside. So I'm actually writing a paper about that right now. But what's interesting is that a strong group of activists, of which I was part of, we got together and we started looking at different, you know, constitutions from around the world, and inspired very heavily by kind of like the Latin movements, Via Campesina, a lot of these different groups, but also states, you know, that are rewriting, rethinking their constitution. And so we managed to put together like an actual group. I wasn't involved in the legislation itself, but a whole proposal was put together of how the new Egypt would have food sovereignty as part of its lingo, of its legal system, and so forth. And it was also inspired because Egypt has a very long history of farmer movements, but the independent farmer movements have always been put to the side. So even though in the government you have very strong, larger kind of farmers, landowners, let's say, the smaller independent farmers' voices are always put to the side. So what's interesting is that the word managed to reach into the constitution, but not with its full rigor. So a lot of stuff was removed, and it became used as a way of just trying to sugarcoat a new constitution that gives the sense that we are proud and we have this identity of an old food heritage kind of thing. But all the little pieces in the middle of rights, farmers' rights, and defining their own cultural, their own food culture, independence, all these concepts that were actually part of the narrative got removed. So it's been an interesting conversation on that legal front. And then on the more popular front, I would say that actually the narrative is not part of people's lingo. It's not part of everyday talking.
And Rebecca, you might know some of this is in terms of in indigenous communities, are people putting, I mean, is there any kind of, because I always think of it, and that's where I know, Elizabeth, you talk about it as a rights framework. And it's interesting because I haven't seen that in a lot of things I've read, but it makes sense to me because I always think of sovereignty as the kind of juridical notion, right? As a kind of, it's a legal notion. And so are communities putting this in their, legal documents and trying to actually kind of make it more codified in some way?
So I actually do think that here in the United States, a lot of federally recognized tribal nations are using that because that is a distinctive political status here. And in terms of governance over the reservation environment, tribes have a lot of potential with their food systems that other communities that might want agency to be able to rehabilitate themselves, for example, out of histories of poverty or dependence, those communities might not have the same governmental capacity. And what I really love about Elizabeth's work, and I think that research methodology that she employed of, talking to these various people from various tribes and communities about the meaning of that term, that's even a different form of, you might say, cultural sovereignty in terms of, you know, how do we want to control the discourse within our community in terms of things that would be rights, but it's very specific to those communities. So there's a political and a cultural aspect of that. And I think I saw Myla and Laura, my great AIS colleagues from ASU. So I know those are conversations that we've had amongst ourselves because we work with those, but I really appreciated Elizabeth's work on that.
Elizabeth, do you want to say anything about that rights framework at all? I don't want to put you on the spot again, but I thought that was, and it also struck me that you were saying that it's a kind of group right. And I know, some of the work that Rebecca and I have done in the past of, rights are, often thought of as kind of individual rights, but seeing it as a right that's held by a group is necessary. I mean, food is not something that you would want to have as an individual right, something you share as a group, right? And so I thought that was an interesting idea.
Well, and the idea of not just rights, but your responsibility to maintain the relationships with the different communities, whether that's the human communities you're working with or the different plant, animal, bird, fish communities that you have to live in some kind of balance and relationality with if you're going to maintain a healthy food system. So I think that's part of what I was trying to get at, and part of what I know Kyle White writes about as well, is thinking about that relationality. So not just rights in the sense of, I am owed this, I should just be given access to this, it's my right to just have food, access to food, but also understanding what are the relationships that you need to maintain with the other humans who are helping to grow and process your food and to whom you want to get this food delivered, as well as the other communities that you have to maintain a relationship with to have a healthy food system.
Myla, you want to jump in there? Myla, do you want to, I know you've been in things with you've talked about those relationships as well.
Well, and I think it becomes interesting, in looking at, those rights and those relationships. And I think also dividing it from not just economic development, but traditional, like I've been working with Walt, who's Yurok, and we've been talking about the fishing, the salmon wars, and his real focus is not on commercial fishing. He said commercial fishing is something completely different. What we need to pay attention to and maintain is our traditional fishing ways and traditional fishing rights, especially when it comes to salmon, because it's two very different things. So while it at least in that case, and similar in terms of because I look at hunting and stuff, it's the same. When you're is it economic development, or is it that you're hunting within the community or for the community, and providing food for the community? So I think it also splits into those different things from economic development to actual traditional ways of being and doing. So that's my 2 cents.
That's good. Yeah. Other thoughts about thinking about this, means I think the sovereignty idea in terms of tribal nations in this country, since they do have a kind of there's a legal framework, that it does have different meaning than other people that don't necessarily have that kind of framework to be able to flesh this out. But
can I say something, John?
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, no, this is a very interesting conversation because it kind of the research that I'm doing now. But I think in terms also of U.S. colonialism and looking at the case in Puerto Rico, where I'm actually doing my research now, about this, this sovereignty is usually in Puerto Rico now, it's very related to the politics and the economic relationship of the island to the United States. And it's very interesting that now after the hurricane and now because there are many community organizations kind of having, doing their own processes of kind of providing like food security for some of the for some of the areas. Now they are talking about food sovereignty. It's a term that it wasn't very common before that. I think it was something that people thought about sovereignty more in political terms, but now people are using the term, and especially those community organizations that are working closely with some people after the hurricane took place in 2017, that we can hear more about, especially in the news and in the media, about the need to have food sovereignty in Puerto Rico, because 85% of the food that is produced, actually consumed in the island, actually comes from here, from the United States. So people are kind of reclaiming that and figuring out ways to kind of produce and kind of have their own food system.
Are they producing food for the mainland? I mean, 'cause I know I lived in Hawaii for a few years, and in Hawaii, they, of course, they're growing all this food that people can't eat, like sugar cane, and so it leaves then the people there, very dependent on outside sources of food. So is that true in Puerto Rico?
It is true. It is mostly now there is a movement, and this is what I'm investigating now, where you have more people, like non-traditional people, like college students and women, actually producing food for the island. And there, for example, like Walmart now has some kind of program in which they go and buy food from local people, and they sell them at the store. So it is something that is being promoted, and this is just happened as a consequence of the hurricane. Yes, definitely. Yeah. Can see that.
So, go ahead.
I was really interested in the piece of the article, Elizabeth's article, where she talks about the problematics around the word sovereignty itself. So I thought that was a really nice contextualization of the concept of food sovereignty, and then just the discussion of how communities are using the word sovereignty now to leverage something they want. So that sounds kind of like what you're talking about, Maria.
Well, and it's funny because in reading all of these critiques of the word sovereignty and, it being based in this very European model. And so I put a post on Facebook and I said, okay, so if people are critical of sovereignty, then what's another term for food sovereignty? And people were like, oh, for God's sakes, like, just leave us that word. Like, why are you academics always trying to come up with a new term? Like, we know what this means. Maybe it's complicated, but just leave it alone. It was like, well, just asking, just curious. But I thought that was funny that was people's response, was sort of like, look, we're just kind of figuring out what this means. Don't be trying to come up with some new and different, word and indigenize the whole thing, because then we're not going to know what we're talking about. And, as a movement, we've latched onto this word, so just leave it alone.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting, apropos of Joni's comment, that there are ways that it can boomerang, and you wrote about that too, Elizabeth, that it could be interpreted in this industrialized food system that surrounds it as a right to eat, which has led to dumping surplus agricultural products on communities that don't want them. So you were very careful about the culturally appropriate, and Maria's point about feeding yourself instead of being engaged in this this reductionist crop concept where you just serve the industrial food supply production process, and so localizing it, culturally appropriate, being able to provide for yourselves, and it doesn't mean just the right not to starve. It means the right to flourish, to have a food system that under which you can flourish, and especially those relationships, which I think are the way you probed those was really evocative, and thinking through those relationships, not only with the food suppliers, the plants and the animals, but with other people. And it made me think about I don't know if Julianne is on this call right now, but she's interested in the idea of the Mediterranean diet having been deterritorialized and put as the ideal diet for everybody in the world, and how that excludes the relationships in the community in the process of growing and consuming the food that are important to why the diet is healthy where it is. So I think all of those factors are really an important part of what you reveal in this work.
I had a follow-up question on that. If we can pitch questions to Hoover.
Yes.
So I was really interested in this. I think builds on what you were saying, Sally, about the relationship between the food sovereignty activities and industrial agriculture. So I kind of had two things I wanted to know more about. One of the definitions in your article that was provided was a 4-point definition, and the fourth one was legislation and policy support to reconcile indigenous food and cultural values with colonialist laws, policies, and mainstream economic activities. So I was curious to hear what kind of efforts are happening in that vein, and then also if any of the tribes you work with also, you know, in addition to the kind of food sovereignty work you're describing, are also practicing more industrial agriculture, commodity crops, you know, stuff like that, and then how they kind of, how the food sovereignty people sort of address that internally.
No, I mean, this project I specifically visited with community-based farming and gardening projects. And so most of them are smaller scale, they're doing organic, they're focused on, or even if it's not certified organic, they're growing kind of chemical free. A lot of folks are focused on heirloom seeds, that kind of thing. There are plenty of native farmers who are, their farms would be indistinguishable from other conventional farmers. And so I have friends who work for the Intertribal Agriculture Council, the IAC, and my friend Dan, who I'm always bantering with all the time, was like, well, you know, at some point you need to also go talk to professional farmers, like people who are growing acres and acres of corn. You know, the IAC is working with lots of ranchers, you know, people who are, again, farming very similar to any other kind of conventional farmer. And, you know, for a tribal community, being food sovereign is up to that community to figure out. And so, you know, there can be some tension in communities where, you know, maybe the tribe is highly invested in a big conventional farm and using conventional methods, when people are like, well, why aren't we growing in more traditional methods that, you know, in the case of the Southwest, aren't as water intensive, that aren't using GMO seeds, that aren't dumping chemicals in the ground in a way that's sort of antithetical to our cultural values. And so there are some instances where, you know, tribes will use the ability to adapt and create their own food and environmental policies to promote a healthier version of that farming. So for example, the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin, because it's a federally recognized tribe that can develop its own environmental rules, has made it so that the riparian buffer, so the buffer between where you stop plowing and a river or a stream, and you want to leave that buffer and not plow straight up to the stream, because then you have all this silt that's washing into the stream. And so the tribe has created rules for people farming on their reservation land that it's a wider buffer than for the rest of the state of Wisconsin. So they're using, as Professor Sosi mentioned previously, their ability as a tribe to create their own rules in that way to make sure that people are, even conventional farmers, are farming in a more environmentally friendly way. So there are plenty of people, you know, to get to your question, who are farming, you know, kind of as more commodity or conventional farmers. I specifically was focused on community-based projects, but there is a whole group of farmers out there who, you know, the IAC is working through the Keeps Eagle case that came down that said that the USDA had been discriminating against Native people who were trying to get these kind of loans. And so now the IAC is working to try to help those Native farmers out there to get more access to these kinds of loans and programs that historically they haven't. So did I get to all the parts of your question there?
Yeah, and that, I don't know if it sounds like it was outside of this particular project, but that fourth point about legislation and policy support, that kind of reconciliation process of, yeah, trying to.
Yeah, so in the cases of creating, legislation and policy, so in some cases, tribes will just wholesale adopt federal policies. So when that comes to like food safety stuff, so saying, okay, you have to have, this many sinks, you have to have all these fences and barriers and everything else, which are put in place by the US federal government because these conventional farms, a lot of gross things go on and people get sick, and all of a sudden you have to throw away all your romaine lettuce for 6 months. Because of this huge kind of unclean food system. And so the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, is passed with these giant farms in mind. So unless tribes adopt their own policies and create their own legislation, sometimes it's like, well, we'll just kind of utilize federal legislation. And so some of these farmers are like, well, why don't we create our own food policies? And so there's a program out of the University of Arkansas that's set up to try to help tribal communities develop their own food policies and to, make sure that tribal farmers are represented in the Farm Bill. So thinking about, and in the cases of tribes that have signed treaties, ensuring, access to land, to fish, to places to go forage and hunt and gather, trying to make sure that tribal governments are refreshing those agreements and reminding state and federal governments of those agreements to make sure people are still being able to access those kinds of foods. So making sure that, on a policy level, reinforcing that.
We had quite a few questions or comments and questions about the style of your essay being in, not just that you went out and you did interviews, but that then you sort of incorporated quotes and interviews into that. And so I don't know if Sarah, you wanted to ask her a question about this. I mean, one of the more interesting questions that we received about this was from Sarah. So Sarah, do you want to talk to her about the way she structured the essay, through storytelling and interviews?
Yeah, sure. So as a scholar in an academic institutions, I'm often reminded there's something called IRB and there's processes and things like that. And so one of the things that I've been very curious about, because I am in my research interviewing Indigenous people, and from my own culture and Indigenous communities here, people introduce themselves and they tell you their histories. There's that part of like giving credit to that long history, but IRB often requires you to remove people's names, again, to protect people, which is also understandable. So I was wondering how you reconcile that component, as well as like, why did you choose to take that kind of approach? Yeah.
So
and can a non-Indigenous person do the same, basically?
When I applied to the Brown University's IRB and went through the whole long rigmarole, they looked at it and they said, oh, well, this doesn't apply. This isn't research. It's oral histories.
Oh, interesting.
I went, okay, like, what do you mean it's not research? I got a little insulted, and they're like, well, there's no independent variable and it doesn't fit the, federal definition of research. And I was like, okay. So Brown just said, no, we don't. And a lot of different tribal communities have their own IRBs. So everybody that I visited with, I checked and I said, do you think I should go through your tribal community? Does your community have an IRB? Do you think I should go through it? Do you think, that they would find that necessary? And everybody said no. So basically what I did was I kept the same kind of informed consent form that, the last book I wrote, I had to go through IRB and, use the same kind of informed consent form. And similar with that book, with this project, I asked everybody, do you want, because I feel like people have the right to choose whether their name is associated with their words or whether they want to remain confidential. And the last book, probably 2/3 people said it was fine to use their name. And there were times when I was using quotes that I thought were kind of sensitive that I chose not to pair with a name. And similar, you know, as I'm continuing to write this up, when I'm talking about some of the challenges in communities, everybody said, no, please go ahead, use my name. But there are times when I'm not, when I think it could potentially come back and offend somebody or come back to bite them in some way, that they might have been like, oh yeah, sure, use my name. But if I'm like, well, I don't want people in your community to be a little offended that you call everybody out on this, that, and the other thing. So I'm just going to sort of mention offhand that, you know, there's a farm in the Midwest that is having these challenges. But in general, people wanted their names associated with what they were saying. And so I felt that it should be left up to people. There have been other projects that, you know, I've worked on here with other communities that did go through IRB, and they gave me a fuss like, no, it has to be, the data has to be de-identified. And I said, no, everybody said they want their names on there. So why should I disregard their wishes because you have a big blanket policy to keep researchers from abusing people? I want to leave it up to people whether they want their names associated with their words. So that's how I've approached and written this project. And there's a lot of quotes and a lot of, and you know, this is what I'm struggling with in the whole book. The chef chapter turned out to be 90 pages long, which is clearly much too long for a chapter. And so I have to cut it back. But part of what I hate cutting back is, you know, I like these big chunks of, you know, from the interview. I want you to hear from them directly. You know, who am I to filter and digest every single thing that people said? You know, granted, some of that has to happen because otherwise it's just a whole lot of interview transcripts. But I find it important to include their words as they were saying it and as they were describing it. And your question as to, you know, can only Indigenous person write this way? I don't think so. I think it's just about respecting, you know, what the people want and their words. And part of what I've tried to do as well is for each of the chapters that I'm working on this book. So the last book I did, The River Is in Us, I hired someone from Akwesasne who had lived there her whole life and who was a big part of the studies to be the community editor. So, you know, the press has its own editors, you get all these other editors, but I wanted her to read through and say, yes, this rings true to the community where I'm living right now. And, you know, every community has their own particular things that can get people offended, you know, little bitty wordings that anybody else wouldn't notice, but people in that community would notice. And so it was kind of, you know, I left that to her to point anything out like that for me. So for this book that I'm working on that I'm going to talk about more in the talk, it includes this food sovereignty chapter and all these other ones. Because the chapters are so different, I hired a community editor for each chapter. So there's a chef reading over the chef chapter, there's a seed farmer reading over the seed chapter. Again, just as a way of and I, you know, when I did the interviews with people and I wrote a blog post about it, I let them read it first and tell me, because sometimes people will say something in an interview and be like, yeah, that's totally cool. But before I made it a public post, it was like, are you really okay with all of your quotes here and the way they're being presented going public? Because I'm just over giving media interviews at this point, because people will sum up your words and say something you didn't mean to say, or they'll take a little snippet of your interview that out of context and then say what you don't mean to say. So I just had a situation with Atlas Obscura, and I was like, can I please read it before I send out? No, that's against our journalistic standards. We can't let you read it. And it's like, okay, but you can cause real messes when you publish things and, you know, put things out there in the wrong way. So they said, okay, so then they hired kind of a community editor, but they still misquoted me. And so then it came out and I was like, why is this word in there? I would not have said that. And she went back and went, oh yeah, you're right. And it was like, well, this is why, because it changed the tone of the whole quote. That she had, like, she'd written gatekeepers instead of stakeholders, which like means something totally different. It was like, wow. So, you know, is it just, you know, can a non-native person write that way? Yes. And then, you know, check back in with the people that you're talking to and whose words you're using, and, you know, check the descriptions that you're writing about them. Be like, hey, does this? And with Facebook now, it's really easy to do that. I have found that I'll just message people and be like, does this block quote that I transcribed from our interviews still resonate with you. Is that all right? You know, how would you describe yourself if I had to put a little quick description of who you are and where you're from? So I think it's about that relationship again.
Yeah.
It's about, you know, kind of maintaining that relationship with people and not just a quick one and done, and then you get to describe them however you want.
Any other questions people want to raise about the article or style or approach? Or we did have other questions, but despite now you guys are all here. Yeah, Mila.
Hey, can I also just say something about that? I mean, one of the other things is there's, you know, there's a lot of work on indigenous methodologies right now, that especially, there I go, Sean Wilson and and Maggie Kovac and all of that, and those are extremely important in terms of when you're dealing with Native communities also, and they talk about, you know, your comment was, can non-Indigenous people, you know, do this work too? I mean, they write directly to that too, so I mean that becomes really important in terms of methodologies.
Yeah, Rebecca, jump in. You're on mute, so.
Thank you. Well, of course, I had one passage I wanted to ask you about, Professor Hoover, and it was the passage from Rowan White on seed sovereignty. And what I really loved about the quote was there was a way that she framed the relationship as you're talking about between self and community. And it was quite independent of a government, right? Because she said that the intergenerational duty is to hold that seed so that it goes to the next generation. And I thought that was really interesting, like in maybe in relation to human rights law that would say, international human rights law would say there's a right to food, and your government should protect your right to food, so that if you don't have food security, your government has breached a duty to you. Whereas in that framework, it almost seemed like the community had this notion of the responsibility to future generations that the government wouldn't even be part of. And then I was wondering what you felt about like seed banks and who should control those. And so, but again, it was your wonderful quotes and the way that you put that that language in there that made me think about all those things. So I think it was quite powerful.
Yeah, I think part of, you know, what I tried to tie it up at the end, thinking about like different levels of sovereignty. So you have, you know, the duties on an individual level, on a family level, on a community level, on a tribal level. And especially, you know, tribal governments can be tricky. Sometimes they work really well, and sometimes they don't work so well. And sometimes, you know, not everybody's getting along. And sometimes it feels like, you know, they have different interests than what you have. And so that's where it becomes important on a family level to think about, you know, what are you doing to ensure that these seeds are being passed on, that they're being shared with other families, that on a community level, that you're developing a different level of relationship that will withstand the next tribal election and the one after and the one after. And so recognizing the importance of looking to a tribal government for developing these kind of laws and policies and, you know, safeguarding treaty rights, but also not just being like, oh, okay, the government will take care of us, but recognizing, you know, what are your duties on an individual level as a member of a community, as a member of a family, as somebody who will be helping to nurture those future generations. And so, you know, where do seed banks fit into this? And a lot of the folks that I visited with were interested in starting community level seed banks. There's some suspicion about some of these bigger, you know, the federal government's great big seed banks, or the Svalbard, you know, over in Norway. There's, you know, they keep saying over and over again, no, we're not a political entity. You know, Bill Gates doesn't own us. Nobody owns us. Monsanto can't waltz in here and take any of these seeds. Only the, you know, the people, communities who put the seeds in can take the seeds out. But people are still a little distrustful sometimes. You know, some people have very willingly sent seeds over and been like, this is a great idea, let's have backups. And other people are like, no, I don't think we want to trust people on the outside to that level. How do you construct a good seed bank right within your community? And how do you share with other communities, so that if some terrible natural disaster comes through and flattens your community, that you can know that there are backups with your neighbors. So being able to kind of have good storage for your own family, but also these other kind of redundancies, I guess. And then keeping things genetically healthy that way too, because if it's just you as an individual growing these seeds every year, the genetics can get bottlenecked sometimes. And so it's important to have these networks and exchanges and relationships with other people so that you can be trading your corn. Especially corn is so finicky that, you know, and it requires such a big population to remain genetically healthy. And so being able to trade with other families and other communities keeps that corn healthy.
Well, I mean, this is just a question about how it is that you know, keep control of those seeds. And so I guess what I had wondered, even though
in the chat, but I think it's quite an interesting question. One of our research members, and there it is. Did I interrupt you, Joan?
That's all right. I was just going to ask my question about the whether or not it made sense to think about tribes holding patents on their seeds as a way of protecting their intellectual property that